4:47 p.m. London was drowning in rain that night. The streets were empty, the palace gates were locked, and standing outside Buckingham Palace, gripping the iron bars with both hands, was a woman who looked like she had been running from something for a very long time. Soaked, shaking, screaming into the storm. Her hair was plastered to her face, her thin coat was whipping in the wind, and her voice, cutting through the rain and the thunder, carried words that made two armed royal guards stop dead in their tracks. "I'm not insane. My name is Margaret Thompson. I was Queen Elizabeth's private secretary for 12 years. Camilla has violated a secret agreement. If you don't let me see the king right now, the royal family will collapse from within." Let's talk about what really happened that night. Because what started with one desperate woman at a palace gate in the middle of a rainstorm turned into the biggest royal crisis in decades. We're talking about a secret document signed behind closed doors, a queen building a shadow empire inside the palace walls, loyal staff members vanishing overnight, and a king who finally discovered that the woman he had sacrificed everything for, the woman he had loved and defended his entire life, had been quietly stabbing him in the back. Accounts from palace insiders and people close to the royal household reveal a story that had been building for years underneath the surface. Nobody wanted to see it. Nobody wanted to say it out loud. But on that rainy Wednesday night, it all came pouring out. When Margaret started screaming at the gates, two guards in red uniforms rushed toward her, rifles in hand. One of them shouted at her to leave immediately. Restricted zone. No disturbances allowed. She didn't move an inch. She grabbed those iron bars tighter and kept going. Her voice was cracking from cold and exhaustion and months of carrying something she wasn't sure she had the strength to deliver. The guards hesitated. One called his supervisor. And within 4 minutes, just 4, King Charles's personal aide appeared at the scene. He watched the security footage on a small screen. His face went completely white. And then he turned around and walked back into the palace without saying a single word to anyone standing outside. 20 minutes later, Margaret Thompson was being walked through a side entrance of Buckingham Palace. Rainwater was still dripping from her hair onto the red carpet as she moved through the corridor. She was shaking, but not from the cold. Those close to the situation say she had been living in fear for months. She had been carrying a secret that Queen Elizabeth herself had trusted her with. And she had waited and watched and finally reached the point where staying silent felt more dangerous than speaking up. King Charles was sitting alone in his private study when his aide came in and whispered the report. Long day of meetings, cold tea on the desk, the kind of exhaustion that comes from wearing a crown that never comes off. But the moment he heard Margaret's name and what she was claiming, every bit of that tiredness disappeared from his face. He stood up. "Bring her to the small reception room." When Charles walked into that room and saw her, this trembling, rain-soaked woman kneeling on the carpet, he looked straight at her and asked one question. "Who are you, and what do you know about Camilla?" She reached into that old leather bag and pulled out a thick, faded yellow envelope. Charles took it. His hands were not entirely steady as he opened it. Inside was a carefully typed document. Clear, specific, and at the very bottom, written in ink that hadn't faded in nearly 20 years, was a signature. Camilla Parker Bowles. Written long before she ever became queen. Charles read every single line. When he finished, he sat down slowly in the leather chair and said nothing for a long moment. Then, Margaret lifted her head and looked at him. "That was the agreement signed in 2005, right after Your Majesty married her. Queen Elizabeth forced her to sign it. Her Majesty once said Camilla would never be content to remain merely a shadow. The room was completely silent, except for the rain beating against the windows outside. Charles crumpled the edge of the paper in his fist. The pain on his face had nothing to do with his health. The most brutal war this palace had seen in decades had just officially begun. To really understand what that document meant and why it mattered so much, you have to go back 20 years. Windsor Castle, spring of 2005. Primroses blooming in the gardens. Queen Elizabeth II, 79 years old but still sharp as a blade, had just watched her eldest son marry the woman the British public had spent years despising. The wedding was done. Charles had gotten what he wanted. The country had exhaled, or at least pretended to. But Elizabeth wasn't finished yet. She called Camilla in for a private meeting, just the two of them. No secretaries, no advisors. A small, quiet room overlooking the flower garden. The kind of meeting that never appears in any official diary and never gets mentioned in any press release. What many people don't know is that Elizabeth had always watched Camilla with very careful eyes. In public, she was polite. She accepted the marriage. She stood beside her son and played the role of the gracious mother-in-law. But privately, those who served her closely say she never fully dropped her guard around Camilla. Not because of the affair, though that certainly hadn't helped, but because she had seen something in Camilla's eyes that reminded her of people she had dealt with her entire reign. People who smiled warmly, moved quietly, and always wanted more than they were ever going to admit. So Elizabeth got straight to the point, the way she always did with things that truly mattered. Camilla, today you must sign this document. This is not a ceremonial formality. This is a vital commitment to the crown. The agreement was short and very specific. Camilla would not interfere in the line of succession. She would not build factions inside the palace. She would not attempt to control royal staff, royal finances, or the media. She would play a ceremonial supporting role beside Charles, and nothing more than that. Camilla sat across from her new mother-in-law and tried to keep her composure. She tried to hold on to that warm, graceful smile that had become her armor over the years. She signed it. The pen scratched across the paper, cold and clean. But the moment Camilla lifted that pen from the page, something had already been quietly decided in her own mind. Elizabeth was old. Elizabeth would not be around forever. And who exactly was going to enforce a piece of paper signed in a private room in 2005 once the Queen was gone? That silent calculation, made in the space of a single breath, was the seed of everything that came after. For nearly 20 years, Camilla played her role with extraordinary discipline. In public, she was the devoted wife. She endured every tabloid attack without cracking. She stood beside Charles at every ceremony, every foreign tour, every public event. She was patient in a way that eventually, slowly, grudgingly, started to shift public opinion just a little in her direction. But underneath all of that patience, something else was growing. Those close to the royal household say Camilla had lived for years with one very specific fear. When William eventually took the throne, and everyone knew he would, where would that leave her? Would she simply be pushed aside, made irrelevant, reduced to some minor figure at the edges of royal events, the awkward reminder of an old scandal that everyone wished they could forget? She had sacrificed too much and endured too much to end up as a footnote. That fear smoldered quietly for a long time. And then, about 6 months before the night Margaret arrived at the gates, it stopped smoldering and turned into a plan. Charles was aging. His health was a growing concern inside the household. The private whispers about a transition of power were getting louder by the month. Camilla looked at the timeline clearly and made a decision. She would not wait any longer. What she did next was not reckless. It was methodical, careful, the kind of plan that only works if you are patient and you never show your hand too early. She started with the communications department. Journalists and image consultants who had been loyal to the Elizabeth era were quietly replaced, one by one, with people Camilla trusted completely. It didn't happen all at once. That would have been noticed. It happened slowly, over months, like turning a dial so gradually that no one could point to the exact moment the temperature changed. Then came Charles's schedule. Every important meeting, every briefing, every appointment that actually mattered was quietly rerouted through Camilla's personal assistant, a woman named Rebecca. On paper, Rebecca was just a coordinator. In practice, she had become the central nervous system of an entire shadow network, a structure that sat right on top of the real palace operation, invisible in the official records, but very much in control of what actually happened. The veteran advisors who had served Elizabeth faithfully for decades began to feel the shift. Their access shrank. Their authority faded in small ways that were hard to prove and even harder to complain about. They were moved to smaller roles and given meaningless duties. And Camilla, crucially, never appeared in any of this officially. Her name was absent from every meeting minute, always working through Rebecca, always 2 steps removed from anything that could be traced directly back to her. This was not an accident. It was a system built by someone who had watched how power worked at the very top for 20 years. Then, in the weeks just before Margaret arrived at the palace gates, something accelerated. Charles had just returned from a meeting with the Prime Minister when he overheard a group of staff members talking in hushed, worried voices in the hallway. Mr. Thomas, 28 years of loyal service to Queen Elizabeth, had been forced into early retirement. Overnight. No announcement. No explanation. Mrs. Eleanor from the communications department had also been suddenly transferred. Charles went very still. He immediately demanded the full list of personnel changes from the past 3 months. What he found stunned him. More than 20 key positions, every single one held by someone absolutely loyal to the Elizabeth era, had been quietly replaced by new faces. Most of them recommended directly by Camilla's aides. That evening at dinner, beneath the crystal chandelier, he looked across the table at his wife and kept his voice perfectly calm. "Camilla, I hear there have been quite a few staff changes lately. What's going on?" She cut a piece of beef and looked up with a warm smile. Her voice was sweet and completely unbothered. "Charles, you're overthinking it. A new reign needs fresh thinking. Those old people clinging to Queen Elizabeth's ways won't help us anymore. I only wanted to refresh things so you can focus on what truly matters." He nodded. He said nothing more. But inside, something had gone cold. When Margaret arrived just days later, with that signed agreement in her bag, Charles finally saw the full picture for the first time. His mother had seen this coming 20 years ago. She had seen it so clearly that she forced Camilla to put her true intentions in writing. And she had trusted one quiet, loyal secretary to hold that document safe until the exact moment it was needed. That moment had arrived. Charles picked up his private phone, bypassing the palace switchboard entirely, and made one call. Sir Robert Harrington, Queen Elizabeth's highest former advisor, retired but completely loyal to the crown. "Robert, I need you. No one must know, not even Camilla." Sir Robert asked no questions. 2 hours later, he was inside the palace through a side entrance, slipping into a secure basement room that had once been Elizabeth's private office. Charles laid everything on the table: the document, The personnel changes, the pattern he had been seeing for weeks, helped me investigate. I want to know exactly what Camilla has been doing. What Sir Robert found over the following days was not what anyone had hoped for. Using his old access and authority, he pulled personnel files, internal meeting minutes, email records, and movement logs for Camilla's aides. Charles quietly called trusted advisors in for private conversations, one by one, at staggered times, with no official record of any meeting taking place. And one by one, the confessions started coming. Mr. Jeffrey, former chief of staff, was visibly trembling when he finally spoke. Queen Camilla met with me privately 3 times. She asked for my support in expanding her control over the royal funds and charitable foundations. She promised that if I cooperated, my position would be safe even after Prince William ascends the throne. Charles listened without changing his expression, but his fists were clenched tight in his lap. Every advisor told the same story. In the past 6 months, Camilla had secretly met with more than 17 advisors and fund managers. She had offered increased budgets, guaranteed positions, and protected privileges, all in exchange for one thing: loyalty to her rather than to the crown. Through Rebecca, she had quietly been pushing to restructure the entire financial management system of the royal household, and she had done all of it without leaving a single fingerprint in any official document. This was not meddling. This was not a wife overstepping. This was a complete plan to take control of the media, the finances, the key personnel, and ultimately the direction of the monarchy itself. The idea was clear. By the time William took the throne, Camilla would already be so embedded in the machinery of power that removing her would be practically impossible. She would be the real ruler, the person every important decision actually flowed through. Whether she held the title or not would be completely beside the point. Sir Robert placed the final dossier on Charles's desk late on the 11th night. His voice was heavy. "Your Majesty, this is no longer suspicion. This is a systematic conspiracy. Queen Camilla is attempting to turn the royal family into her personal instrument." Charles sat motionless, eyes red, completely still. He didn't rage, he didn't shout, he just sat there with the weight of it, the pain of a man who had sacrificed his reputation, his public image, and his relationship with his own mother for decades, all for a woman who had been quietly planning to use everything he had given her. But Camilla had already sensed something was wrong. Within 48 hours of Margaret's appearance at the gates, she noticed the change in Charles's eyes at breakfast. The distance. The silence where there used to be warmth. Then a loyal staff member slipped her a quiet warning. Margaret had met privately with the king for over 20 minutes on that rainy night. Camilla understood immediately what that meant. At 2 a.m., she called Rebecca. Her voice gave away nothing. No panic, no hesitation. Make a list of every advisor still loyal to Charles. Replace them all. No advance notice, no explanations. By tomorrow morning, they must be gone. By early morning, more than a dozen senior staff members had been suddenly retired or transferred without any official announcement. Phones were disconnected. Some were quietly escorted out by palace security before most of the household was even awake. Camilla then gathered all mid and senior palace staff for an emergency 9 a.m. meeting. She stood at the front of the room in dark attire, voice sharp and completely controlled. Anyone found contacting the opposing faction, meeting Sir Robert, associating with those who served under Elizabeth, will be dismissed immediately and stripped of all privileges. I will show no mercy to traitors. If you wish to keep your positions, you need to know exactly which side you are on. The room went completely silent. Hands shook under the tables. Some eyes filled with fear. Others exchanged quick glances, the kind that said everything without saying anything at all. Camilla believed she had won. She thought she had moved fast enough to cut off Charles before he could act. But she had made the one mistake she could not come back from. The advisors she had just ordered removed, most of them had already spoken privately with Charles the night before. They had already made their choice. And when the dismissal orders came through, they didn't go quietly. They went directly to the king, carrying everything. Emails, recordings of private conversations with Rebecca, detailed notes of every promise Camilla had made. They chose the crown, not the queen. The confrontation came that same evening. Private dining room, crystal chandelier, just the two of them seated across from each other. Charles set down his knife and fork and looked at her. "You think I know nothing?" An aide entered and placed the thick dossier and a small recording device on the table. Charles pressed play. Rebecca's voice. Then Camilla's, unmistakable and clear, promising positions and protection in exchange for loyalty after William's ascension. Camilla went white. She tried to call it fabricated. She tried to say it was jealousy from the old guard trying to drive them apart. She tried everything she had, and she had a lot. Charles opened the dossier and slid it across the table toward her. These are signed statements from 14 advisors, complete with dates and internal emails. You have violated the 2005 agreement my mother forced you to sign. You built factions. You controlled personnel. You manipulated royal funds. You promised privileges to buy loyalty, all so you could seize real power regardless of title. He looked at her for a long moment. You turned this palace into your own kingdom. For the first time in as long as anyone could remember, Camilla broke. She wept. She said she had done it all for the family. For stability, because William was young and Catherine lacked experience, and someone needed to hold things together. Charles shook his head slowly. You did it for yourself, for your ambition. My mother saw through you back in 2005, and today I will not make this public. The royal family cannot endure another major scandal, but your entire network will be dismantled. The loyal advisors from my mother's time will return. The royal council will meet privately to consider stripping your title. Catherine will replace you in official ceremonies. She screamed. She begged. She told him the people would call him a betrayer. He turned away from her. The people will understand when they learn the truth. As for me, I have chosen to protect the crown, rather than a marriage that died long ago. The next morning, everything moved fast and quietly. Rebecca and all of Camilla's trusted aides were removed. The veteran advisors came back to their positions. Sir Robert took his place as special counselor. The entire shadow network that Camilla had spent 6 months carefully building collapsed in less than 72 hours. Camilla was moved to a secondary palace under the official explanation of resting for health reasons. She sat alone in that large empty room, a woman who had clawed her way to the very top of the most famous family in the world, and stared at nothing. A lifetime of ambition. Gone because of one old agreement, one loyal secretary, and one rainy night at a palace gate. King Charles stood at the window of his private library the next morning and watched the sunrise over the Buckingham Palace gardens. He felt no victory, no relief, only a deep, quiet sadness that settled into his chest like something permanent. He had saved the monarchy. He had honored his mother's final act of foresight. He had made sure that William and Catherine would inherit a house still standing on solid ground. But the cost was real, and he knew it. These stories reveal something that no title or palace or crown can ever fully protect against: that ambition left unchecked, even inside the most powerful institutions in the world, will always eventually find a way to the surface. Queen Elizabeth knew that. She prepared for it quietly and patiently for 20 years. And in the end, it was her preparation, a signed document, a trusted secretary, and one stormy night that saved the House of Windsor from itself.